Have you ever wondered about the difference between vulnerability and risk? When we're discussing a new assessment project with an owner, we're just as likely to be asked to do a vulnerability assessment as a risk assessment. People think they're the same thing, but they are different, even though they're most assuredly related. So let's talk about the difference. You might think that this is only an academic question, but it can lead to confusion. Owners can get results they did not intend. Projects can be poorly scoped, and in the worst case, the confusion can lead to cost overruns. So what is the difference? I'm going to return to fundamentals and consider the definitions used by ISO in the ISO 31000 series of risk standards. First, consider vulnerability. ISO defines vulnerability as the intrinsic properties of something resulting in susceptibility to a risk source that can lead to an event with a consequence. Vulnerability is a quality that makes a system open to harm, but it does not consider how likely the system is to actually experience an event that causes that harm. Mostly, it suggests that should the event ever happen, part of the system would respond badly. Vulnerability analysis exposes the cracks. So, how do we define risk? ISO defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Effect correlates with vulnerability, and uncertainty is equivalent to likelihood of an event. In our work, we translate ISO's definition of risk into an equation that we use in most of our risk analysis. R is equal to E times L times C. And in this equation, E represents exposure to the hazard. Does the system see it or doesn't it? L represents the likelihood of a hazard event even happening. How probable is all of this? And C represents the consequences of the event if it happens. How much will it cost? And are there other negative outcomes? As a risk specialist, I can go on and on about the nuances of this deceptively simple equation. But for this exercise, let me focus on the consequences. Consequence is directly related to the vulnerability of the system. The more vulnerable the system is to an event, the greater the consequences. And in this way, risk includes the ramifications of vulnerability. We take the results of vulnerability analysis and build in an understanding of the likelihood of the event. This allows us to identify not only that a system is vulnerable to an event, but also how much weight to put on that vulnerability. If a system is very vulnerable to an event, but the event is very rare, it may be less meaningful to the system than a smaller vulnerability to an event that happens all the time. These subtleties can be understood through the examination of risk. Vulnerability analysis can be formal, as in many standard vulnerability and risk assessment procedures, or VRAs. These procedures first formally analyze all of the vulnerabilities of the system, and then use the formally identified system vulnerabilities in the risk assessment. Or it can be informal. Many standard risk assessment procedures work this way. Users identify potential consequences based on professional judgment, experience, and other techniques to identify specific features of the system where consequences have been observed or should be expected. The analysis does not include a formal review of all of the system's vulnerabilities. These approaches identify specific areas within a system that are susceptible to an event and identify potential consequences. So, vulnerability and risk are tightly integrated. Vulnerability is a measure of the susceptibility to an event. Risk builds on this and provides a measure of the importance of that vulnerability. Risk allows us to rank the various vulnerabilities of a system and prioritize actions. When planning an assessment, it's important to clarify if you are interested only in the vulnerability, or are you interested in the prioritization of vulnerabilities afforded by risk analysis. Now, the terms are often used interchangeably, and that's okay. But when planning and executing the work, it's good practice to have the conversation about vulnerability and risk. From this, we can strictly define what the work is aiming to achieve. This is an element of the scope of the project. Now, this all begs the question, when do we do vulnerability and when do we do risk analysis? Each has its place. Some owners do vulnerability analysis before they consider risk. Then they can focus on the risk analysis only in areas within the system where the cracks are already showing. This can save money by reducing the scope and reach of the assessment work. Sometimes both are done in the same project, vulnerability analysis feeding into the risk assessment. Some projects skip the vulnerability analysis altogether, relying on organizational memory, professional judgment, and other analytical tools to inform the work. The approaches are all valid. The key is to make sure that the entire team understands the scope and objectives of the project. Like I said, on the surface this is pretty academic, but confusion about this issue can have serious implications. As in most of our work, clear and agreed definitions are important. Confusion about vocabulary is always a problem. Taking the time to have a conversation about vocabulary is never wasted.